Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. Once again, I'm Clark Coffey, and with me, as always, is Colin McFader.
There we go,
that
Jinx.
Was nice, Jinx Abracadabra. You owe me a Coke, man. Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you back. We're happy to be here. This is, which is like mind-blowing to me. I can't believe we're already at episode 16. Whoa.
Crazy, yeah.
I know, it's wild, huh? Time flies when you're having fun. This is, we'll be covering lesson 17 of Herzog's Masterclass at masterclass.com, which we've both taken. By the way, just a little like free, props for Masterclass. We both obviously
That's how we met.
Enjoyed that whole experience because, well, here we are years later doing a podcast that's kind of based around it, at least here in the beginning. But this lesson 17 covers editing, which I think is, if there were ever something that was fundamental, right, to an art, to a medium, editing is as fundamental as you could possibly get to filmmaking, right? Editing is kind of what makes it filmmaking almost, I think,
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'm excited to go over this lesson. I think Herzog brings up some really interesting points. And right off the bat, let's just jump into it. Right off the bat, Herzog talks about, and this is interesting, right? Because there's some distinctions that we can make here. He talks about being careful that you don't force your intention in the edit of the film, right? So he talks very much about kind of like that this footage rather, is going to kind of seem to want to go in certain directions, perhaps, right? It's almost like it's going to have a will of its own.
Yeah, it's like divorcing yourself from that.
Well, or being open to it, right? And
divorcing yourself from the footage in terms of like your own will and all that.
Okay, right. That's what he talks about. So instead of imposing your will with like rigidity, he talks about really being open, allowing yourself to kind of intuitively get a sense for where does the footage want to go? How does the film want to kind of congeal? And it's interesting because, of course, he also talks very much about shooting with extreme focus and intent, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if anybody was ever against being a fly on the wall, kind of setting up a camera and just letting things happen, I would say Herzog, has spoken out most strongly against this out of practically any other
no
documentary.
Interest in it.
Right, out of any documentary filmmaker I can think of. So it's not that you are just, sitting a camera down on some sticks and walking away and just letting it run for 30 hours and then you say, hey, let's see what we got. I mean, he's very much about making things happen and manipulation and shooting with, opinion and perspective. But I think he's talking about here is, okay, well, once you get all that footage and you're in the editing room, don't force a round peg into a square hole.
Well, it's this idea for him that it's like pretend that you were a different person than who shot the footage. Well, it's, like this idea of stumbling across footage and just, finding it. And it's like, get into the mindset that you weren't the person that shot it, that if you were to just edit this footage that you just came across, right. How would you do it? And kind of, think like, obviously think like an editor in this instance, but kind of, again, try to, pretend that you are not the person who actually captured this footage and that you're now stumbling across it and you're finding the best moments and finding the bits to stick out and to emphasize and, how that rhythm comes out too is like, and I think everyone who has edited their own stuff and shot their own stuff has experienced this where it's, whether it is the case of, when you're on set and things seem to be going horribly and then you sit down in the editing room and you go, wow, this is actually pretty good. Or even just on the basis of you might think on set that you're going to edit it a certain way or that something is going to happen in a particular way and it's going to cut together like this. And then you get to the edit and you go, actually, it's going to be completely different. That doesn't even work.
Yeah. I think you Herzog mentioned it and you're calling it to it, this idea or kind of this way of thinking of, when you step into the editing room, try to put yourself in the mind frame of, I've I don't even know where this footage came from. I mean, it's playing a little trick on yourself, so to speak. But it's just kind of a way of saying, really being open to the possibilities that exist with the footage you actually have. And you're right. I mean, I think, in my experience, right, I've generally speaking, when I go in and I'm shooting a film, I kind of can see the edited film in my mind. right? I have this, you're probably the same way, right? I think many people are probably, where I kind of have this very strongly preconceived notion. I mean, actually, as I'm writing it, this starts to develop for me. I kind of think visually. I think obviously many filmmakers do. It's why you're drawn to the medium. And so sometimes it's, you can kind of really restrict yourself, right? If you're so rigidly holding on to this vision that you've had ever, since you wrote it, and the footage may not lend itself to exactly that. And actually, it may lend itself to something much better than you ever preconceived. These wonderful, beautiful accidents happen, whether they're in performances, of your actors, or whatever whatever happened on set or on location. There could be some really beautiful accidents.
Yeah, so and very much with narrative, but I almost want to say too, especially with documentary. I wrote the documentary I just did about home video and all that. Was written in a very particular way. It wasn't really a screenplay, but I had the chunks laid out as to where the story went, and probably halfway through the editing process, I showed it around to a few people and got feedback, and that feedback wound up completely changing the structure. That parts that were supposed to be at the end of the movie wound up at the beginning, and it just completely, and it made it way better. It kind of wrapped the whole thing up in a nice bow, as opposed to just what it was before, which was kind of more of a traditionally told story, which I thought was really interesting.
Now, so in this instance, let me just double check, make sure I understand. So you're saying that you got feedback. You presented this to some other people. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think I had it in my mind as to what I wanted it to be, and then the feedback wound up making me realize.
So you did. So you went ahead and you made a cut. Is that what? And then Well, so that we can bring this up too. Herzog talks about this aspect of editing a little bit later in the lesson, but it's a good place to bring this up. About you've gone through the process, you've got an edit, or you've got a cut rather. How do you address getting feedback from people? And
and not working with yes men and stuff like that too. Yeah.
Right. I mean, a couple things. I mean, Herzog talks about, first of all, he doesn't edit films by himself. I think a lot of people just starting out oftentimes do find themselves editing their own films in entirety, especially if they're short films.
And budget wise too, is of course, it doesn't really make sense often to spend the money to get another editor, right? Yeah,
right. Which I think speaks even more to really trying to work to keep yourself open-minded. Because you're not going to have this this other layer of interpretation or objectivity, if you will, if you don't have another editor in there. But I think it's a great idea to start hopefully you can find some people who are maybe at the same level as you, if you're just starting out, who are willing to work for credit or deferred payment or something, and start to work with an editor. I think it's a vital skill to have. Obviously, as you progress through your career, it's unlikely that you're going to be the one actually sitting at the computer making the edits. You'll be working with an editor. And that objectivity is really important to bring to the table. But it's also important to get back to what you were just talking about with your project. Okay, this is like how to deal with feedback and get the most out of it without being overwhelmed by it. I mean, I think everybody who's ever created anything has found this to be really challenging. Gosh, I know I have. But some of the things Herzog suggests, I mean, he talks about, showing it to people who he knows aren't going to kiss his butt, right? That's obviously important.
His older brother, which is a funny little story that he calls his older brother the boss of the family, which I can't imagine somebody bossing Herzog around. But
I know, I would love to see that, huh? I would love to see that. But that's important because, I mean, I know that, it's sometimes is a big pull for me where I'm like, I want to show my work to people who I kind of know are going to tell me nice things about it. Because
there's a pull to do that, right?
Sure.
You have a confirmation bias, right? Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, please tell me something nice. I'm probably feeling fragile
I worked
and
so
sensitive.
Hard on it.
Where it's like, Mom, come on, this is great, right? But no, I think we all kind of have a little bit of a pull to do that. So it's important to remember, okay, wait, hold on. Okay, yes, it's like strokes the ego to get some nice feedback, but it's not going to make your film any better. So to actually show it to some people who you can trust to really be honest, I think is key. And Herzog also talks about, and I have not done this for a film that I've directed yet, but I was a producer for a horror film where we did this, and have large audiences. Herzog talks about the importance of doing this for comedy.
Yes, yeah.
And I think, because it's, and I agree.
I've been a part of one of those too. I've been a part of
you've been a focus group audience as an audience. Yeah. It's that one, that's a really interesting science. Putting a focus group together, asking questions that are going to elicit feedback that's usable, that's actionable, is really, really tough. And that's outside of the scope.
Sometimes it can be really corporatized, and it can be very, you turn it into, especially with these bigger studios, you hear these kind of horror stories about like focused audiences and test audiences becoming just literally marketing pitches, right? And it's like, how willing would you be to buy an action figure based off of this?
Well,
it's ridiculous stuff like
that. Certainly, if we're talking about a Marvel movie, I mean, those things are likely focus group to death. And I think most major studio feature films, large budget films, are focus group to death. And then, you kind of have a film that's made by committee. And Herzog actually talks about that too, about the pitfalls of trying to make a movie that's for every possible audience out there. And of course, Marvel films or action films are that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? The domestic box office is no longer sufficient. The global box office is vital, and so
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and so they've got to make a movie that plays to every single audience in the world, young, old, male, female. Whether you're in Japan or China or Turkey or the United States or Canada,
or
right?
Algeria,
right.
I also I want to say though that it's the irony I've always thought about that, and that's a very, it's not necessarily the most recent phenomenon. It's been going on for 2, maybe even 3 decades now on a mass scale. But what I do want to say that's interesting about that is that I find the movies that we look at as classics, those movies that came out in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that we really are like, these are the classic Hollywood movies.
Like Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah, Weekend at
Bernie's.
Well, but like even just like you think of like the original Star Wars, Indiana Jones. I do love Weekend at Bernie's. It's no joking matter.
I do too.
But any of these movies that Aliens, whatever, big blockbuster movie you can think of that came out in that era.
Yeah.
That they were successful not because they were aiming to reach the widest possible audience. They were successful because they were goal-oriented in terms of what they wanted to do with the movie and what the story they wanted to tell was, and that the audience followed. And it's almost this kind of paradox, which is like if you chase the audience, you're not going to get the audience, or at least, there's no denying that Marvel movies are successful. But in 20, 30 years, will anybody remember specific plot points or lines? I don't really think so. I think that there's going to be people that are always super fans of them, but I don't think that they will have the cultural impact of, these groundbreaking movies that came out in the decades before because of that. Like, I think that that's kind of the irony, and that's kind of the paradox of it, is because
do you know what that's called? So there's a name for that.
Oh, really? Okay.
There is a couple names. So it's actually funny that you mentioned this. We can we'll take a little digression into the world of philosophy for just one moment. But I don't know if this obviously, I think most of us have experienced this kind of the seemingly existence of these paradoxical effects in life with effort and result. And I think people have talked about this in Buddhism and Zen for a long time. Alan Watts, a countercultural philosopher, he was British, called this the law of reverse effort, or the backwards law, which is basically says that if you push for something very strongly, you will actually decrease your likelihood of obtaining it. And I agree to a great extent, actually, that if you put all of your energy into trying to, into creating a film that's going to work for every possible audience, it won't work very well for any.
Yeah.
And you can, I would even go further and say, actually, if if you're trying to do work that you feel will be accepted by an audience, and that's your primary focus, it's likely not going to be a very good film. It's not going to come from within you. It's not going to be an authentic voice. It's going to be premeditated and cynical and striving, and that doesn't make for very interesting film, in my humble opinion. But I really appreciate you bringing that up.
And I think that there's actually a really great example of it, and at the avoidance of becoming a pop culture podcast, because that's not what we are.
Right.
I'm putting my fist down. But
okay.
But I sound like Nixon now. But but I do want to say that
you and your impersonations.
But there's an interesting example of that. That's kind of been talked about to death, but just a really quick digression is the episode, I guess it was 8, the 8th Star Wars movie of this new
oh my gosh,
series,
which is the 8th one?
That was
I have
the
lost
Last
count.
Jedi, which was the controversial fan, the one that fans didn't like but critics liked. And
sure,
I thought it was decent because I thought it was different is
okay.
what I found.
I have no idea what this film is that you're talking about. I don't know which one this is.
That's okay. I don't blame you, but
that's okay. Maybe
but
some
there is an interesting relation to what we're talking about here, which is that the 8th movie came out, which was directed by Rian Johnson, who did Looper and Brick, and just most recently Knives Out,
which were good.
And I think that he's really an interesting director. He's got a very interesting voice, very unique voice. Yeah. And so he did the 8th Star Wars movie, and it took the series in a direction that a lot of fans were unhappy with, because they were like, "Where's this? Where's that? That's not supposed to happen in Star Wars." And I thought it was kind of a silly backlash in a way, because I was like, who cares? It was, I thought that the things that he did in it were more interesting than anything that had been done in most other recent Star Wars movies. So I was fine with it.
Right.
But then what you found was that you got, Disney and Lucasfilm see that backlash and go into the 9th movie, which is the final one of the big series, and completely bought into all that backlash and did exactly what we're talking about, which
Nothing
is
but
chasing after fan service, test group focused, like, what did people like about the last one, what they did not like. And I can guarantee in 20 years people will look back on The Last Jedi and think, oh, that was actually interesting how they made some interesting decisions there, and they kind of went against the grain of the rest of the franchise with that one. Nobody will remember the most recent one, because the most recent one was it was panned by critics and audiences. It wasn't very good, period. But I do think that that's interesting, and I never want to talk about Star Wars ever again. But
you know what?
But
that's
I thought
totally
that it was an interesting kind of real world example of exactly what we're talking about.
Unless perhaps sometime in the future we mentioned Herzog's performances in The Mandalorian. That might be the only other situation where we're talking about Star Wars on this podcast. But I mean, I agree, right? And I think, look, if you're listening to this podcast, clearly, Cullen, you and I are actually recording this podcast, and we're focusing on Herzog. I think.
Hang on, this is being recorded?
I
didn't sign an NDA.
You know what? And in California, only one party has to give consent to recording. So that could be me, and I'm recording, and you wouldn't. But we're just going to get all over the place. We'll talk about some law. We'll talk about philosophy. We're talking about pop culture. We're just going everywhere with this one today. But now I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, but look, I mean, if we're talking about Herzog, clearly we're fans. Clearly we're inspired by his work. I mean, it's the authenticity of his work. The fact that he's making films for himself, and not to say that he talks about this. He says, look, this isn't all about you. The director doesn't have final cut. The producer doesn't have final cut. The financier doesn't have final cut. The audience does, right? But he's, what he's talking about there, though, is not. I mean, I don't think, I think it would be a misconstruence to say, well, what he means is shape the film to make the audience happy.
Yeah.
No, he's saying, look, ultimately, the audience is going to determine, how to say this.
It's success and its legacy.
It's success and its legacy, and it's gonna. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that distinction that you just made is really, really important, because I think people so often confuse the two, where they go, like, I think that that's a huge thing, and it's a huge part about taking things with a grain of salt. I've shown friends cuts of movies, and this goes back even to the film school thing, or the difference between going to film school and not going to film school. But I've shown friends who have gone to film school a cut of a movie, and they've gone, Chop 8 minutes out of it, or chop some arbitrary number out of it.
Right.
And it's like, because it's just been instilled that, the shorter is better because it'll get to an audience faster. But then Herzog even talks about, the opposite, which is, what if we sit on a shot for an unusually long amount of time?
Right.
And that imposes this idea that this shot is now important. And I that's one thing that I think is lost in major movies today, which is just this idea of being able to sit and make it atmospheric and allow things to sink in. And reflectiveness too. I think that you almost have to put, if you want an audience to reflect scene to scene on your movie, you almost have to put a disclaimer at the beginning saying you're allowed to think about what you're watching right now. When the movie is slow, don't just think it's boring. Think about what's going on.
Well, and this is the thing. Funny. But this, and this is the point, right? Is that you cannot please everyone. And you just have to be willing to accept that if you're lucky, your film is going to find an audience out there. If you're lucky, right? Because it's tough. I mean, it's a very difficult thing in this world to have your work seen by enough people where you have any size of audience. But if it's okay if there's a lot of people out there, right? If you've got however many billion of people out there, and they're like, and a big chunk of those people say, this is too slow for me, the editing is not, why are you sitting on this scene for 5 seconds? This, if it's okay. You're blessed to have a small core of people who are moved and touched and inspired by your film. Yeah. My goodness, Herzog has never been a big
trying to impress everybody. That's
when has Herzog ever been like a blockbuster filmmaker? When have his films ever
But at the same time, so plenty of his movies have reached universal praise and success. Like I would say, Grizzly Man is one of my favorites.
Some of his films have definitely, have definitely kind of broke through. And obviously, look, he's got decades and decades of work now. But I guarantee you, though, look, I don't take this for granted. if I went out in my neighborhood and I asked 50 people, I just walked down the street and asked 50 people who Werner Herzog was, name a film or two of his for me, I would be surprised if 10% could do that. So we live in a little bit of a bubble where, we are filmmakers, we love film, we're cinephiles, we clearly are steeped in Herzog. If I walked in my street, my neighborhood, and I asked people who Steven Spielberg was, I'm pretty sure 99% of the people I asked would be able to tell me, right, above the age of 18 or something. So
if you go upload something to YouTube, and no matter how amazing it is, no matter how 99% of people are thumbs upping the video, you'll always have 2 or 3 dislikes. That's the thing. There's always going to be, and I think that's the idea of where it's again, and this is going to sound like a broken record, but take everything with a grain of salt, because there are also times when even if I'm sitting in a room with 3 other people and they all say, this should change in your movie, there are times when I would say, okay, I'm wrong. But there are also times if I believe really strongly about something, that I will say, no, I don't care, I'm keeping it, because that part is something that needs to be in there. And that's kind of where you got to find the balance. You don't always have to listen to the criticism or the
certainly not. And this really gets to the crux of a major creative a major part of the creative challenge, if you will, in creation and bringing something to people, right? Is when do you listen? When do you take an audience's feedback, and when do you stand firm in your intuitive, in your beliefs of what this should be? And that's a question, my goodness, that, philosophically we could talk about for a long time, but that's, this is one of the main fundamental aspects of creation. And ultimately that you have to find that within yourself, right? But certainly, and Herzog talks about this in this lesson, that there are times to listen and there are times to stand firm. And you can only really look inside yourself. Yeah. To answer that question, and each one of us is going to have a different, line that we've drawn for that. So,
even down to the fundamental technicalities of editing. I know people who will, and I've worked with them, and some of them are very good friends of mine, who will say that, I'm never editing my own stuff. I'm always sending it to another editor because it needs another, and it's like this steadfast concrete. And they, when I say, no, I cut this myself, they're like, oh no, I wouldn't do that. But it's like, I've never bought into that. I've never, and there you'll find that, especially if you're beginning. Well, you might be more attuned to it if you're beginning, because it's sort of a thing that kind of sticks out, and you might get used to it later on. But film is full of that. Film is like the film industry, but be it in pre-production, production, or post-production, is filled with people who think that rules are concrete. That there's no way that you can get away with doing a movie without doing X, Y, Z,
right?
That are set-oriented rules. Blah blah blah. I've had these conversations with people on online and in person, and it's really. I always think it's funny. It always makes me laugh because I'm like, at the end of the day, what you're going out to put a camera somewhere and filming something. That's what you're doing. I get that there are rules in place to make that easier and to make sure that you don't lose the footage, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, just think about what you're trying to do.
Put it in perspective here, guys. Yeah, it's like you're not a surgeon.
No, exactly.
Generally there's I wouldn't call it dogma, but there are very strict procedures, right? There's everything from how an OR is like kept, how people sterilized, how a procedure is done. This is like very rigidly proceduralized, activities, and for good reason. But this is not filmmaking. This is not art. Exactly. Yeah. It's like, keep things in perspective a little bit.
I think on that point too, that there's this bit where in the lesson where Herzog talks about throwing out old footage, which I am just in love with.
Yeah.
Because that's what I do. I will finish a cut of a movie. I will have it maybe the final cut for maybe 6 months or so. And at that point, if I still like am it's out there and I'm happy with it and there's nothing that's horribly wrong with it, I delete all that old footage. I do not keep, unless there's something that I think would be good in a reel or something that I could use for something else, like a great landscape shot or whatever.
Sure.
I might keep stuff like that. But in terms of the every single audio file, every single video file, no. And there's some people that are, Terrence Malick is famously not like that. He just released a new cut of Tree of Life 2 years ago, and he's still re-editing.
Coppola just released a new cut of Godfather 3.
But I have no interest in that. I am like Herzog says in this, where it's like the carpenter doesn't keep his shavings.
Sit on his shavings.
I'm the same. Once I'm done a movie,
I love that.
I like to basically get the final cut, put it on a hard drive for an archive and a backup, and that's it. That's the final cut. I don't need any of the old stuff. I don't even care really about. I'm not somebody who's obsessed with remasters even. I appreciate them when they're done well and there's this whole new, whatever, it's a restoration. But in terms of something in the digital age, everything is clean enough that you're not going to get a point in 2050 where somebody is like, oh, this was shot on the Zoom H, or this was recorded on the Zoom H6. This audio is so unusable. And that's exactly what I mean, though. It's like people future-proof to future-proof for some.
Well,
sometimes. I think it's funny.
It's funny. I agree with Herzog, and I agree with you, but I cannot say that I follow through with my own beliefs completely. Mm-hmm. There's definitely some cognitive dissonance here for me right now, because although I agree, I have to admit that in my closet, in my office, I have a box of hard drives, and there are probably about 40 hard drives in there of all shapes and sizes that contain not just final cuts, but actually contain raw footage and audio, and you know what, I can tell you from personal experience. A lot of people might ask to say, well, what's the harm? What is the harm of keeping all this stuff? And I because I think sometimes it's maybe hard to put your finger on. So what's the big deal, right? Well, I think there actually is a cost to this, and maybe talking about this right now is going to motivate me to go ahead and finally toss this stuff out, or at least reuse the hard drives. Of course, why throw out good hard drives? But I think there's definitely there's a couple things. I think one, it's all of this kind of digital clutter. This kind of just hangs around like if your house is cluttered, right? It's kind of a distraction to you all the time. It's like, well, this, I've got all this footage. It's kind of like hanging in the back of your mind. It's like there in the closet. It's like, well, maybe I'll do something with it. No, you're not. I'm not going to do anything with it. It's just a distraction,
Yeah, and I think that so often it's almost a temptation to go back and fiddle with it too,
when you need
and
to be going forward, right?
Yeah.
When you need to be going forward, right? It's a diversion of energy. It's a diversion of focus, and really, I mean, I think it's just kind of, I think it's a distraction of focus that keeps you that has you looking backward at stuff you've already done, and the likelihood that you're going to do anything else with it is come on, it's basically zero, or else you would have done it. And if you did go back and do it, so let's say that 1 in a million chance came along and you did do something with it. I mean, come on. If it's sitting under your bed in your closet, how inspired are you really? How motivated are you really? So what kind of work are you going to do with it? It's not going to come from a place of inspiration or motivation, right? It's like, it's coming from some other place, like obligation, or, well, I've had these things in my closet for years. I guess I should do something with it. Screw that stuff.
It's just like this weird forward, like security of just like, well, what if the project gets corrupted and I gotta, I've got to re-export. It's like that is so rare, and there's no, you're hoarding for the sake of hoarding. But I also think,
agreed
with what you just said, is, and Herzog doesn't specifically touch on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was similar in this way. That is, the most I'll keep in the long term is, and usually just for educational purposes, is like maybe the 3 rough cuts or something like that.
Right.
And that way I can kind of go back, and sometimes it's a little bit fun to go and watch the first cut of a movie and sort of go, okay, that's what I did. Those are the decisions I made. And again, for education too, since I teach a class, it's very useful.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
To go back and sort of say, like, here was the first cut of this, and then, but just exactly what you said, in terms of the full raw files of, footage that are massive files. Always.
They're huge.
They're always even if you're shooting on a really, really file size friendly format,
terabytes,
there's still going to be huge amounts of footage.
Yeah.
I have no interest. Yeah. I just, like you mentioned, just like Herzog mentioned, I have no interest in keeping those around. It also, to me, almost, and maybe this is just kind of, philosophical, but I find that it prevents me from feeling like the work is done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if I'm happy with a final cut, if I've got the footage still sitting around, I still feel like there's potential that, again, in 10 years, I might go back and I have that little voice in my head. And so I don't really find that I'm completely satisfied with a work until I almost force myself to be, by just deleting all the archived raw footage, and then I'm like, now there's nothing I can do.
Well, and this is important, and we've touched on this, in a few different ways, but it's definitely something that Herzog talks about in this lesson. It's being decisive, learning to be decisive, and great segue. You've tied it into this too. If you're saving all of your footage, we've talked about this for shooting too. We've talked about, look, don't just take after take after take and coverage. Just get all the coverage you can possibly get. You are putting off the decision making, which is the heart of your art. And it's the same with this. If you're in editing, and being decisive is just an absolutely vital part of this art. And I think this is tied into that, right? Herzog talks about, and I, of course, I love the way he always puts things, but he talks about, look, this is a profession. This isn't your pet. You've got to be a professional. Yeah. You've got to, and of course, we've talked about this many times. Herzog is clearly a very intuitive filmmaker. And so he talks about just, the foot, what speaks to him. And of course, ultimately, I think we all have to be, right? Ultimately, we're all kind of relying on our intuition. This is kind of what art is. We balance that with some feedback, which we've talked about. But yeah, ultimately, editing is about making decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to put in a caveat there too for things like director's cuts, which are a different beast, because I think that most often a director's cut is created because of marketing, marketing, but also sometimes, I think of Once Upon a Time in America, where it was, the movie was significantly cut down, and I think
studios forced changes that the director.
I think Leone said, the movie was neutered by studio interference, and then went and created the director's cut. And I prefer the director's cut. I think it's a masterpiece. I think the original is very good too, but I think that I can see why. And same with
Blade Runner.
I think Blade Runner, the final cut, is the best cut of that movie.
It is.
So there's a difference there, where it's like, if I was working for a big studio and I didn't really get the motion picture I wanted at the end due to that kind of thing, sure, I might keep that footage around so that I can then go back and make the movie that I wanted. But oftentimes, too, that director's cut is going to be an earlier cut anyway. You're already going to have that cut that was then changed. Yeah,
correct.
So
yeah, that's likely the case. It's not that you've gone back and you've re-edited the film. It's more that, well, this is the edit you wanted, but compromises had to be made.
Usually when I see a movie or a director that does go back and do exactly that, which is like this going back after the fact and saying, you know what, maybe I could tweak this, like the final cut of Lucas, but also Coppola. I mean, the final cut of Apocalypse
doing
Now,
that too. Yep.
I saw, and the final cut was not nearly as good as the original.
I was sitting with a friend. Godfather 3?
For the Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now, okay, because I haven't seen Godfather 3. I'm curious to see that. Apparently
the death changed.
Apparently he changed the ending, and I haven't seen it, but
I'll have to watch that one. But I saw the final cut of Apocalypse Now in theaters, and me and a friend both saw it and sort of said, like, what was the point? You know,
pretty substantial.
Nothing was added to it.
Footage, but
I mean, there was added footage, but nothing.
You don't feel like it added to the story, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, and I would, look, I would love to have Coppola in front of me, and I would love to ask him what his thoughts were there. Was it because he felt like he had to make these compromises at the time, that the film was too long, studio wouldn't allow it, whatever, who knows, if it was like, no, this is really, really the film I wanted to release, or was it something that came to him later and he thought,
if we're doing a 4K restoration, might as well. Yeah.
Right. I don't know.
No, but I do think it's a really interesting topic. I mean, I think that because it's so in line with edit. Like I know people who would never ever do that. Like my friend Blair, who I work with at the company I started, he is a DIT person and works primarily in post and is an archiver. So his philosophy on this is completely different. Like he is like, we've got to get a hard drive, we got to save, all of our raw footage goes on to 3 different hard drives for multitudes of backups, blah blah blah, stuff like that, which I can appreciate. I mean, I appreciate the
it's important as you're going through production until the film is released,
and then at that point I don't care.
Absolutely.
That's kind of my,
now that's a whole different philosophy. Right, and that's a whole different technical conversation about backups and backups of backups. I mean, that's a whole different absolutely. There's about file management and archiving during the production process, but once the film it's finished, it's released, it's done, keeping all of this raw footage is a different thing. But I mean, can you imagine, though? We've talked about Coppola, Ridley Scott, many other directors released director's cuts for various reasons. But one of the things that's so endearing to me about Herzog is that all of his films are director's cuts. There are no, I mean, can you think? None of his films has he gone back and tweaked them and said, no, this is like really the film that I wanted to release.
I don't think any of his films either he's come out and said that he wasn't proud of. Like, I don't think he's ever come out and said, oh, that one didn't go so well.
Well, except for, I think, one of the first films he ever did, and this story is a little bit sketchy in my mind right now, but I think there was an issue where something happened on set. Could this have possibly been with an animal or something? It was one of the first films he ever did, and he said he'll never release it. I feel bad that I don't have this exact memory, perfectly formed in my head, but I'm pretty sure I remember there was something about some kind of, I don't know if an animal was injured or if there was some kind of animal cruelty or something on set, or actually not just on set, I mean on camera. And Herzog says he'll never release this film. So I'm pretty sure there is a film that he doesn't want to ever see the light of day.
But to be fair to that too, that's not necessarily the quality of the film, it's more the subject matter.
I don't think so, right.
But I don't think, as far as quality, I don't think he's ever gone back and said, I could have done that one better that way. Which I think is a great, and maybe that is, a direct result of his throwing out the old material. Like perhaps, who knows, if that one aspect of his personality was different and he kept that footage, perhaps we would have, a whole bunch of director's cuts from Herzog. And it could be.
Yeah, I do want to speak to this really quickly since I had a quick second here to look it up. So you're right. I don't think this is necessarily a question about quality, but just since we're here, we're talking about Herzog, a little bit of trivia. So actually, his film titled Game in the Sand, which was a short film that he wrote and directed in 1964. The plot apparently concerns 4 children and a rooster in a cardboard box. And okay. Actually, very little is known about this film. It's never been published. It's never been publicly shown. And Herzog states that he'll never give it a release in his lifetime. He says that the shooting got out of hand, and that's kind of all he's really ever said about it. And so you're right. I don't think that he's saying, I don't think that this film has artistic merit or quality, but he's saying maybe more for moral or ethical reasons. He doesn't want it released. So yeah. I was like, I'm pretty sure there's a film out there that, but you're right, totally different thing there. But this is one of the things that inspires me about Herzog. The fact that he's been able to maintain his autonomy and that he's been, that he is so decisive in the edit and of course behind the camera and with his writing, and that the films that he releases that are the films that he wanted to make. Films are always compromises, but I mean that these are films that he can completely stand behind. Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that.
And I've got to say too that there's, just to retrace our steps just for a second, about the idea of editing, whether it's on your own or using somebody else to edit and sending that footage off to another editor. Mm-hmm. I had a great conversation with a friend of mine recently where she was, we were talking about this idea of and it was for the feature. She's one of the people that's producing this feature that we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And we were talking about editing and, what do we do when we get to post? Do we hire an editor, et cetera? And it was actually, what was nice about it was also, it was a very casual, it wasn't really a formal meeting. It was just us having a casual hangout and just this stuff came up. And we were on the same page where we were just kind of talking about the fact that it's like, whether we send it off to somebody else to cut that movie together and to get, I'm doing air quotes with my hands to get a second pair of eyes on it versus us as a team, or even just me cutting something together and then showing it to other eyes. Again, there's some people that are very, very pedantic about that and kind of go no, you have to get it in another person's hands. Yeah. Whereas again, it's one of those things where I'm thinking I'm going to get that feedback either way. I'm just more likely going to like the cut more if I do it myself, or at least I'm involved in that first cutting process versus, and especially at this budget level
sure.
where you send off editing or footage to an editor. And of course you're not paying them a lot, and it's not their fault that they don't get to it because they're not being paid a lot.
And
you don't get it back for 2 months. And then 2 months later you get a cut and you're like,
lucky.
Yeah, exactly. I've got, we did a movie. I didn't direct again. It was, but it was under my production company that we shot back in February, and I think it's like a 5-minute short film, and it's still being cut because the director, it's his way of working, but he was very adamant that he sends it off to another editor, and that was his way of working. And so I'm not going to fight him on that because that's his process, but it kind of again reinforced to me this idea of I could put that together in 2 hours into a work print cut rather than having to wait. Now what's coming on,
Well, this is a great point. Yeah, this is a great point. Obviously, for people who are at that stage of your career or the projects are that size, I totally agree. I mean, I've got a situation where a documentary film that I started shooting over a year ago, and my producer partner on that film, we decided that we would take our footage. It's a documentary, a lot of interview, a lot of following people around. It's called 1,000 Miles to Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And we spent all this time and money traveling around the country filming. And we kind of, I was like, well, he felt very strongly about having somebody else edit it. I thought, okay, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to explore that. And here we sit and we don't have a cut. Mm-hmm. We went through a process where we hired an editor. It didn't work out very well. We didn't make progress anywhere near as fast as we had hoped, and what we saw was not really terribly usable at the end of the day, even after all this waiting. And so I've been thinking quite a bit about going back and, okay, I'm just going to sit down, I'm going to break out that footage, and I'm going to start cutting this thing myself. And, because it's when we don't have a ton of money behind this project. So, right, it's not going to, to find a talented, motivated editor and be able to motivate them to put this in their list of priorities and get it done with with a deadline that's not way off in the distance. It's tough. So you often are going to find yourself.
It even goes back to as well the idea that we talked about, I think, in the first few episodes, which is just this idea of thinking like an editor while you're directing. And some people don't do that. Some people are just focused on the shots and things like that, or working only with actors. Some directors are very, very kind of focused in that way, whereas I am able to kind of juggle those things and kind of go, I know what this is going to edit together like, even if I don't write the movie.
Sure.
I think that and at the end of the day, what I always kind of say is whether, if I take this, if I have a cut in my mind for this and I take it and I edit it, whether or not that edit works or not doesn't matter. Because if it doesn't work, people are going to tell me it doesn't work. I don't need to send it off to somebody else to learn that doesn't work, because I'm going to find out that it doesn't work because people will tell me, even if I cut it myself, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest kind of for thing me, is.
Sure. I think that for me, the thing that I hold out hope for, the thing that I'm looking for, though, is for somebody to add to my vision.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, and it's the same with actors, right? We've talked about working with actors. It's the reason I don't want to give line readings. It's the reason that I'm not, stuck to a script like it's, written in stone. Ideally, you have collaborators who are bringing more and more and more to your vision, right? As the director, you own the vision, yes. Mm-hmm. But ideally, you've got people who are able to bring their expertise in and add to that. It's not that they're changing your vision, but they're adding to it. I mean, filmmaking's a collaborative art form. With the exception of, the smallest of small films where you're literally doing every single job, but that's pretty darn far and few between, right? Mm-hmm. It's a collaborative art form. So it's like another example that I have where I kind of, I collaborated on the editing. I worked I'm kind of credited as an assistant editor for another feature film that's soon to be released. And I didn't sit down in front of the computer and edit this thing. I assisted them by watching the film that they brought me in late in the process, right? And they had already had a cut, and they know they're having some challenges. It's not the film that they thought it was going to be. They've gotten some challenging feedback a little bit, or they're working to make it better. And they asked me to sit down with this cut and help them work on it. And so I pulled together about 30 pages of notes, and then I sat down with the editor, and we talked through these things. And I hope I was able to bring, I'm trying. It's so, in that position there, it's not like I'm trying to change the director's vision. I'm trying, okay, what was your vision? So I'm talking to the director. I'm like, talking to the writer, what were you trying to do here? Help me get inside your head as much as possible. And then I can help them try to shape this in a way that's going to match their vision. So hopefully I was able to do that and bring some value to that,
And also, I just want to clarify too, that I'm not in any way adverse to somebody else cutting a movie of mine.
Cullen, I'm getting a sense that I know what it is.
I am a control, as you've said before. You've worked with me on set. I slap people. And
I've still got bruises and scars from that incident.
But it's more that if somebody else is cutting the movie, I'm there in the cutting room with them.
Sure.
And that I'm involved in that process. What I don't like, and what is probably the most common style of editing in the indie market, if you don't have if you're not editing yourself, is exactly that idea of just sending it off to somebody and not being able to be there with them.
Sure.
And that's what
I would never recommend that.
Yeah. But it's so common. That's the thing, is it's almost become a norm, which is just this idea that, and I think a lot of that does, again, come back to this idea of film school, where the way that film school trains people to make movies is that, like, if you're the cinematographer, you're the cinematographer, and you're going to get marks off if you do anything else. So it's this very, again, dogmatic approach to, the director. If you're the director, you have to get someone from the editing program into to edit your movie. And I've again, I didn't go to film school, but I've experienced this firsthand when I was.
It's likely because they're trying to teach students how to work within the boundaries of unions.
I think it's kind of ironic, because it's like, you just wind up teaching people that you have to do this, you know, X, Y, Z.
Right.
But I think that I experienced it firsthand once when I was, you know, I'd offered to do cinematography on a friend of mine's movie who was in film school, and they said, yeah. And so I started doing it, and then they got in trouble from their school because they were like, they weren't using somebody from the cinematography class to do their cinematography. So it's this, again, it's this funny kind of very rules oriented thing, which I think can be sort of harmful to learning. I think filmmaking is so much about finding your own way to do it, and that there isn't really a steadfast
I will
solution.
add this caveat though, is that can be very challenging to do as you move into more professional realms, depending on your country, etc.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Depending on your region, where not if you're working on union films, that can actually be quite challenging. So I can see where I agree with you to a great extent that it's, you know, having the flexibility to move from position to position, to have the flexibility to kind of share tasks and have a more organic structure to the production. But also in reality, though, and again, especially at higher levels, you're definitely going to have to deal with different departments and very specific skill sets and very specific, like basic, like union requirements for what people can do and can't do. So being able to work within that as well, I think is still a worthwhile skill. But if that's the only way you work, I think, you know, there's a blending of the two of those things where appropriate.
And I will say too that, like, you know, I'm completely pro-union, of course, and I think that it's great. But I think a lot of times those restrictions and those union-based restrictions are more you know, they're created because of labor. They're not created because of you know, creativity, right? They're protecting labor rights of workers. So they're not. Whereas I think that Herzog embodies this idea, like the style of filmmaking that I really love. And I don't mean style in terms of like what his movies are about and what they're like aesthetically. I mean the style of his approach to the craft is something that I really admire, because he breaks down those ideas where it's like, you can trust him to say to you, you know, if you're on a union set, that like respect those rules and respect those, you know, very, very important rules. But at the same time, to be able to say, no, I can take this and I can cut it together. I'm not shafting anybody out of a job. I'm just using the creative process to prove a point and to get an idea across, which I think is very admirable, because a lot of people won't do that. A lot of people will just kind of sit down and go, okay, well, the rules are rules.
Well, you find ways to work within the system, right? You can find ways. If you know, like filmmaking is a big chunk of this is creative problem solving, right? I mean, every day there's ways to do it for sure. Where you can manage the requirements of all these aspects, for sure. You know, something that I want to touch on briefly, because I don't think we've talked about it too much yet, but I think it's something that I know it's something. I don't think it's something that Herzog talks about in his lesson, but I think it's important. He talks about just kind of like some logistics about how what his process is when he sits down with his editor. And I think this is great advice, and I highly recommend to people to do this. I do this myself as well. But he talks about working with a logbook, basically. And so, you know, you shot all this footage. Now you're sitting down to watch it. And I actually kind of intuitively, I mean, I guess I taught myself how to edit like you. I didn't go to film school. It was by necessity. I had shot some things. I wanted to make for myself my own work as an actor. And so that's how I kind of fell into writing and directing. And okay, well, now I've got this footage. I have to edit it. So I kind of taught myself how to do that. And this is kind of how I ended up just falling into doing it. But I would sit through and I would watch all the footage and I would make notes. And basically, I would just, you know, what stood out to me, what takes stood out to me as being the best. And I just started to make notes about all the footage, you know, this take, and just had kind of created a logbook. I did mine in a spreadsheet, actually, on my computer. And Herzog uses an actual notebook and writes longhand. I think, well, whatever floats your boat. But Herzog talks about the importance of doing this. And I agree. that you watch the footage, watch all of it before you start editing. I don't know if that's how you work, but I totally agree
exactly
with this.
It's dailies, right? I'll sit down and watch all the dailies and everything and make notes.
Yeah, and it's instead of, because I think I'll kind of draw an analogy here. He talks about, look, watch it less and remember more. So one of the great things about writing is that, of course, it's going to help get the memory of this footage into your mind faster. When you write things down, that helps with your memory. But it also keeps you from having to go back and watch again and again and again and again. And I think, it's the same thing we talked about when we're working with actors. And I think I had talked about how I do not like to, quote unquote, memorize lines, because what most people are doing when they're memorizing lines is that they're memorizing by rote. And if you say something over and over and over and over and over, what happens is that it just starts to become abstract sounds. And
it loses its meaning.
There's no meaning. There's no connection to any kind of emotional content there. Well, I think the same thing happens when you're watching your footage. If you watch your footage over and over and over and over and over again, you're going to end up becoming numb to it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what happens too. We're talking about having editors come in, finding that having this objective voice to help you edit. If you're unable to do that, look, in every instance, I think this is a tool that's really useful. One of the ways, if you're acting as your own editor, this is a way that you can try to help maintain some objectivity and not turn numb to your own footage, which is use a logbook and don't watch your footage over and over and over again.
It's funny because it's another one of those things that I think I inadvertently stole from Herzog just without knowing it, but I do the exact same thing, which is longhand in a notebook with exclamation marks. Okay. And it wasn't until I, rewatched these lessons and I went, maybe I just subconsciously took that from him. But it's also, I did the exact, like when I was doing, again, this home movie documentary, I had hours and hours of footage, both from my childhood and my dad's childhood, that I just sat and watched through all of it and did that exact thing, which is just making notes. And that was, of course, documentary, and it's applicable to narrative. But sure. I think also it's one of those things, again, that kind of a great tip that that I've heard and that I use for, because obviously you're going to have to watch your footage a bunch just if you are seeing it, it's really important, as you said, to not get numb to it, and not exactly like when you watch it over and over to not. But a really, really simple way to actually prevent that sometimes is just mirroring the footage and literally just applying a mirror filter to it so that it flips. And I find that sometimes that immediately, it's probably something just with your brain that immediately goes like, oh, that's new. And that can be both really, really, I learned that from visual effects that, because obviously if you're working on a visual effect, you're going to be working on it for weeks and narrowing those things down, and eventually you can just start losing context as to what looks real, what looks not real, what you need to work on. So a lot of visual effects artists use that, which is just reverse the footage, and immediately it looks like something new. It looks like something you didn't create because your brain has been looking at it a certain way the whole time. But you can take that principle from visual effects and apply it. So I'll often do that, which is if I make a cut of something, the first time I watch it, I'll actually watch it mirrored. So it doesn't look like the thing I just cut. It actually just comes out as something that's completely new. And I've found, that it has honestly helped a lot with just feeling like I'm watching something that I didn't make, and feeling like you're more of an audience member. Because that's it's like this super, super simple thing that's probably, again, just like fooling your brain. Like it's one of those things that just kind of subconsciously you don't really notice. But it's a great tip. But again, this whole idea of writing down footage, there is a great tragedy to people that, will shoot a whole bunch of stuff and then wind up missing because they don't want to watch all the takes of a scene, or they'll just go to the last take because they'll go, okay, this one's the best, that's what we're using. Right. But they won't watch the moments. And that's something you'll notice so often in, major movies, is that and I saw this, it's on my mind because it was recent, but Parasite, there's a lot of moments in Parasite where Bong Joon-ho and the editor, I can't remember the editor's name, but they actually combine two different takes of scenes in one take. Like they'll just do the classic cut on a pan or something like that, and it'll be, you know, because they liked one actor's performance better in the other take, and they liked this actor's performance in this take, and it's
happens
not
all
even
the time, right?
It's not even cutting back and forth as in like a shot reverse shot.
Jinmo Yang edited that, by the way.
Okay, yeah. So they did that a lot in Parasite, and I'm sure they did that in Bong's other movies as well. But it's again, you learn these tricks that you don't, without forensic analysis, you can kind of miss. And I think that forensic analysis can be very bad in some ways, because I don't think that you should be analyzing frame by frame movies in terms of like content and trying to pull every ounce of meaning, because you'll just start inventing meaning. But I do think that it's really important in terms of technical skills to kind of go like, how did they, you know, that's a really neat thing. I can sort of see the cut if you slow it down. So why did they do that? And kind of learning about it that way and going like, okay, so there you go. There's a lesson as to why you should watch all of your takes and watch all
every
of your footage.
take. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you might find that there's just something subtle in one that works and something in another.
Absolutely. That's a good point. That's a good point. And just one more reason why, you know, logging all of that is so helpful. If you've got, you know, however many takes, you have 30, 40 hours of footage, you know, making notes of those moments can really make it a lot. It's because it just gets overwhelming fast. Even on a short film, the amount of footage you've got and takes, it can get crazy. But but that is a great point, because usually, I even in very casual projects of my own, that's often the case, is that I often am adding, you know, taking moments from multiple takes. It's very rare that I just have this one take for this entire scene. Everything was, you know, better than everything else. I'm usually mixing up moments. Yeah, and, totally. And so that's a great point. Yeah,
and that's kind of the fun about editing too, is that you're kind of it's literally cutting and pasting. Like you're basically going like, I like that bit, and you pull it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with your audio as well. I mean, we could the goal of this is not to get into the technical aspects of editing, but you know, yes, you've got your visual, you're editing the visual information, the moving pictures, but you also have this extraordinary opportunity with your audio. There are so many moments where if you're not seeing the actor's mouth moving, you can do anything you want with the audio, you know, and oftentimes even when the actor's mouth is moving and it's very plain, there are a lot of things you can do with audio. So that's kind of a whole other episode there. But there is an extraordinary world of opportunity in editing. So, wow. Well, I think, Cullen, we've covered pretty much everything from Herzog's lesson. Can you think of anything that we didn't cover? I think we got it pretty good.
I think I think we did a decent job on this.
I hope so. Well, hey, look, like Herzog says, it's up to the audience. It's up to the audience. So we hope that it has been a fun experience for you. It's always fun for me. I love doing these because it, you know, and you probably experience this when you teach too, but it helps me so much to kind of talk about these things and, you know, I often try to put myself in the perspective of, you know, in the mind of someone who doesn't have, I would still consider myself very much a beginner. I consider myself very much in the learning stages of doing this, for sure. But I try to put myself in my mindset of even, you know, 15 years ago or 20 years ago when I really had no experience. But this always helps, you know, to just kind of remember some of these things. I feel like every one of these we do, I kind of come away with like, oh, like your thought on, hey, you know, mirror just flip things around, and that can kind of be just enough of a switch to kind of refresh your brain on it. And then I'm thinking to myself, well, what about color? Like, I don't think I've ever taken my footage and made it black and white and then watched it. I'd be curious to do that. That could be a lot of
fun. I will do that for fun sometimes and just kind of see what it looks like.
But there's a way to see it differently, and I will even add further, and I have done this, is to watch it without sound, but then also to just listen to it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different things, you know. So, and sometimes you just forget the stuff, you know. It's like, oh crap, I forgot.
I mean, I'm really lucky that I do see a lot of that with teaching, because so often it is just like
it reminds you over and over. So it's a great way to learn yourself. So I'm very appreciative for that. All right, well, we'll wrap up then. Cullen, as always, man, thanks so much. You bring some like wonderful ideas to the table here, and I always really enjoy having these conversations with you. Next week, we're going to be moving on to lesson 18. And if I am not mistaken, lesson 18 is titled Invaded by Images. And that's there's a two-parter, right? I think lesson 18 and lesson 19, they're Invaded by Images 1 and 2. So I'm excited to revisit those. It's been, I'll have to watch it again now. It's been so long since I've watched these things, but I will rewatch it, and we'll be prepped to come back next week and talk about the next lesson.
Totally. Yeah.
All right, man. Well, great. Well, until then, everybody have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon.
All right. Bye, everyone.